So, welcoming onto the air, we have our featured artist for today's show, Joe Jencks. He's a Chicago based musician, traveling the international folk circuit for over 25 years now. Here to answer some questions and tell some stories. Did I miss anything, Joe?
No, actually, we're up to 27 years now that I've been
27
on the
years.
road full time and traveling across the U.S. and Canada and beyond. I've traveled extensively in the Caribbean and in Ireland. And last year, I made my first trip to South Africa. So, yeah, it's a big
How was
world,
that?
and I'm determined to see if I can let music be my passport to see as much of it as possible.
Well, that's a ambition and a half right there. Uh, so I've been to a few of your shows, and you always tell very funny stories. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more, like your work for the archive, the American Folk Life Center at the Library of Congress. You've recorded a few songs for them, and I was wondering if you had any more to say about that that can't be found on your bio page.
Well, it was a fascinating project. This was done in the summer of 2020. Everybody was in lockdown, and the Library of Congress Folk Archives, the American Folk Life Center (AFC), as it's called at the Library of Congress, had a budget for doing a summer concert series, but then the concert series was not going to be viable, and rather than just do kind of online concerts like a lot of people were doing, they decided they would use it to fund research projects and get artists to dig deeply into the archives and celebrate certain aspects of folk music, or, the broad umbrella of folk music. It's not just one thing. I mean, to me, the birth of jazz is a point where folk music and what we now think of as jazz kind of separate, but jazz to me falls under the tent of roots music, and therefore to me is related to folk music, bluegrass, newgrass, Americana, certain aspects of country, certain aspects of indie rock. I feel like have been a little bit of a roots movement in rock and roll to get back to a different kind of folky, bluesy heartbeat there. Blues is definitely, to my mind, a kind of folk. So for me, folk music is music of the people. Folk music is music that people will play in their living room, that people will play hanging out with friends on a Friday night, that they're empowered to play. It doesn't take a whole band, and it doesn't take a lot of production. So by that definition, a ukulele orchestra is folk music, or people that just sit around and like to play, or the old mandolin groups that used to play in the 19 teens and 1920s. And so folk music is for me a really broad definition. Excuse me. Folk music is for me a really broad definition. Um, but I feel like what I do is touch on several facets of that. And when I had the privilege to dive deeply into some of the roots of American folk music as recorded by the Lomax family in various prisons in the 1930s in the South, I knew that I was going to be tapping into a different vein of folk music than I had spent most of my life invested in, which is a little more, for lack of a better word, kind of mainstream acoustic, Americana, singer songwriter, plus all the Celtic stuff that I do because I'm a dual U.S. Irish citizen. So that was an amazing project, and the invitation to dig deeply somewhere that was outside of my comfort zone was fun. And I also had the time because I was off the road because of the pandemic. So it was great working with the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, and anybody who wants to see that whole production, if you just go to your favorite search engine online and type in Joe Jencks, JoeJencks, and Library of Congress, a video should pop up straight away that you can watch, and you can see all the sort of awkward pandemic production and geeky photos that I found diving through not just the audio archives at the Library of Congress, but some of the visual archives that correspond.
Yeah, I'm just always impressed with that because just the main weakness of archives is that they are not eternal. They require constant upkeep and revisions that need to be happened. And so, like, yeah, whenever I think about archives, I'm always wondering, okay, when's the next Library of Alexandria going to burn down? 'Cause
Yeah, I mean, the joy is that so much of the archives of American folk music have now been digitized and are diversified and are saved in multiple places. So a lot would be lost if they lost the physical archives, but they've also worked very hard, to get the archives from the initial, almost like Bakelite discs that they had recorded on in the 30s, and cylinder recordings onto magnetic tape in the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s, and then digitized from the 90s moving forward. So yeah, but you're right, it requires a certain amount of effort and energy just to maintain the technologies that will allow people to go back and listen to things that have not been transferred to more modern mediums. And it's an amazing thing. It's an amazing thing that we all have access to it. And the general public are welcome to cruise the archives as well, those that have been digitized. You can just go to the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress website and just start searching things and finding things. And it is kind of an endless rabbit hole.
so to go on for a second point, 27 years of traveling. You're also card carrying member of the AFM Local 1000, the North American Traveling Musician Union. I'm sure you have a number of stories that, because like this whole set I've thrown together are a bunch of union songs and worker songs, from various genres and time periods. Some with deeper histories than even I imagined. I'm sure you have a few funny stories that have gone on with that.
What drew me into labor music, I would say more than anything, was that it told the story. Working songs of workers' movements, told a story that was about people organizing effectively to push back against the advancing machinery of society that was increasingly dehumanizing. And I say this sort of jokingly, but kind of honestly, that between growing up in a working class community in Rockford, Illinois, where I was born and raised, and, just like seeing homelessness on the way to school, walking to school, seeing people being evicted from their homes because they'd lost their jobs and couldn't pay the rent anymore, couldn't pay a mortgage anymore. I witnessed a lot of people struggling, and I also am the youngest of 7 in my family of origin. And I say this a little tongue in cheek, but also with some earnestness, that to be born last into a big and complex social system can at times feel a little oppressive. It's like everybody else knows what the rules are except you. And nobody offers to help you, but they definitely offer, criticism if you do it incorrectly or inadequately, and it doesn't occur to them that nobody ever explained the rules to you. And so when I started finding various forms of labor music in my teens, there was something about it that was very comforting to me, because it was evidence that people before me had worked to organize against systemic oppression wherever they found it. And it emboldened me throughout high school and college to speak up and speak out when I saw something that seemed unjust. And I was also raised Catholic, and that really informed my own sense of our commitment, our obligation in some ways as human beings to speak up when we see injustice happening, and to intervene and to do something about it. And yeah, so that's not really a funny story. There's a lot of weight to that, but it's the honest truth. I think I was predisposed to see systemic oppression, and some of that is also the input of older siblings who were, some of them enough older than me, that they were really invested in social justice movements even when I was a toddler. They were invested in participating in the world in that way. So even as a kid, I was getting dragged out to demonstrations or protests, or sometimes, I mean, we use the word protest in shorthand, but I think in truth, sometimes what we're witnessing isn't a protest so much as a demonstration for the world that we want to advocate for. You know, you could say, well, they're protesting low wages. So you can say, well, they're advocating for better wages. They're advocating for a living wage. They're advocating for worker safety. They're advocating for access to better health care. And in my experience, advocating for the things that we want is often a more effective stance than just protesting against what we don't want. You know, if we can give people a clear vision of what it is that we're working for, whether that's, you know, on a city council or a library board or a school board or a church board, whether it's in a neighborhood watch group or, you know, whatever it is. Like, all of us are involved in some way in a homeowners association. You know, all of us are involved in social groups that are also in a process of being administrators of something. And I think when we bring a rich sense of justice with us everywhere we go, an awareness of privilege, I think we can do some good in the world. And sometimes it's unnoticed and very subtle, but it changes things for other people. And I think the most elemental foundation of that is kindness. When we choose to move through the world as people who respond with kindness and compassion, I think we begin to change the tone of all other communication around us. And I think I latched on to music because I realized music was a tool at my fingertips that could allow me to change the tone. And if I could change the tone, I could also eventually change the conversation.
Well, I gotta agree with you on there's a very specific point that I feel needs pointing out. Like, English doesn't have enough vocabulary to describe the different types of protests that are out there. Because, like, I was at one point, you know, as an information handing out for some Red Rebels. You know, it's an extension of the Extinction Rebellion, but they're specifically nonviolent demonstrators who basically dress all in red, put on mime makeup, stay silent, and walk through spaces very slowly and with sad eyes. And that is all they do. And they walk through, and I saw like a bunch of business owners get very tense because they thought something was going to happen. Because, you know, when they asked for more information, it was my job to hand it to them, and the only information I could say was, you know, it's a form of protest, silent, dignified, as it were, you know, very peaceful. But as soon as the word protest was them, they got very tense, like it was about to devolve into a riot at any moment, even though it was a bunch of little old ladies in white makeup and red clothing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is a very ancient way of pushing back. A lot of Buddhist monks have engaged in walking meditation as a, you know, just a way of demonstrating, I think, what peace looks like. But when people organize and then don't do anything, you know, in a way that people expect, yeah, it makes them uneasy. And I love that group of people are pushing back in a way that's really, it is peaceful, it's nonviolent, it's transformative, it's art, you know, it's a walking meditation, it's a lot of things. So yeah, I mean, protest and demonstration can be many, many things. And for me, music has always been a very powerful way of stepping into those spaces. But there's also the rich, compassionate human element. So I sing a song written by Woody Guthrie and co-written. The music was written by a fellow named Marty Hoffman called Deportees. And it's a song that tells the story of migrant laborers in the late 1940s who were killed in a plane crash at Los Gatos Canyon in California. And it's told from the standpoint of somebody who was friends with them and has survived them. And it's just a beautiful song that reminds us that there is a human element in any story we encounter. And it invites us into that humanity. And I think in some way becomes a mirror by which we see some piece of our own story, even if we're not a migrant laborer working in the orchards in California. When we get in touch with the humanity of the people who are, we're touching back toward our own humanity as well. And that really, for me, is the power of music. And sometimes it's a festival. I mean, sometimes the work is to bring activism into the festival environment, but sometimes the work is to bring the festival atmosphere back into the streets and back into the demonstration and the rally and the protest there, and let that be a celebration. And we've seen a lot of that with the No Kings demonstrations. I've seen some very strong festival element to some of those events. Of the three No Kings events I've been to one in Tempe, Arizona, one in a town near where I live now in Illinois, out in the cornfields. And then I was in Wilmington, North Carolina for the most recent No Kings. And it's beautiful to witness the growing momentum of that movement. Very powerful.
With the No Kings protest, my main gimmick has been to dress as whimsically as possible because someone's going to do it. But during a few of your shows, you've mentioned it was unpublished stuff that you went through. No, it was a different musician. It was like, I guess I must be mixing stories up with different.
There, Cy Khan.
Icon.
Cy Khan is a friend of mine. I would say in some ways at this point a sort of legendary labor organizer and songwriter and community organizer who lives in Charlotte, North Carolina, but he grew up in State College, Pennsylvania. And when he got out of school, he was connected to the civil rights movement for quite a while. During the Vietnam War era, he served in the reserves here in the States, but was doing a lot of work documenting and I would say organizing, even in that time. And then he took things that he had learned on both sides and brought it into the labor movement and then into community organizing. And all the while, he was a musician and a songwriter, and a good one. But he wrote so many more songs than he ever got around to recording. And so he set me up with a recording of dozens and dozens. I think in total it was somewhere between 70 and 80 songs that he'd written, some of which were just snippets, just little bits and pieces of something that he wrote for a particular reason and then mostly never came back to. And he wanted to know if I was interested in doing anything with him. And so I just had these audio recordings of him doing demos. And then a couple I threw back at him and said, hey, can you give me a second verse on this or a third verse on this? And some I added bits and pieces to. And but mostly I did some pretty heavy arranging and found, about a dozen and a half songs that I really wanted to focus on. And then I think about 14 or 15 made the final cut. But yeah, it was great to work on that project and to collaborate with Cy on making sure that, again, it was almost like some of the archival work that I eventually did, with the Library of Congress. It was resurrecting something that would have been lost. And so the name of the album is The Forgotten, Recovered Songs from the Pen of Cy Khan. And the funny thing about that, and we used to joke about this, is that neither one of us used a pen for songwriting anymore, that most of it all happened in a computer. Just a little bit of rich irony there.
Yeah. I actually do have a question about Rise as One. Like you first released it on a different album. Hang on. Rise as One first came from I Hear Your Voice in 2003, but then you released another album titled Rise as One. I think that was a live album because I heard a lot of audience participation in that one.
Yeah, the first iteration of Rise as One, actually I think the copyright date on it is 2002, but mostly it made circulation in 2003. And it was a song that I wrote about school workers out in Ashtabula County, Ohio. I was living in Cleveland at the time, and I was invited to go out and play for the school workers there who had just wrapped up a successful strike. And it was an interesting experience for me. I was in my mid to late 20s. I guess if it was 2002, I would have been 30. I was born in 72. So I was finding my way more deeply into the labor movement, and it was the music that had brought me there. It was the music that dragged me into this work of people organizing for some kind of social justice. But I got connected in Cleveland to some really rich community organizers and advocacy work on behalf of immigrants, and like the labor work was just the tip of the iceberg. And that song came out of a direct story that a worker told me. It was 98 workers in this small town of Jefferson Village, and they were trying to haggle what amounted to a really small amount of money and a small increase in health care benefits over a 3-year contract. And what they were asking for, sum total, was about $300,000 over 3 years for, call it 100 workers. And the school board spent $500,000, 500,000, to hire a union busting law firm to try and prevent these people from getting what amounted to about $1,000 a year over 3 years. And it was ludicrous to everybody who heard the story that they were saying we can't afford these increases in wages, but then they spent an extra $200,000 to hire a union busting law firm rather than pay less money to help the people who, help their kids, like, people in their own community, their neighbors. And it represented a kind of greed and ideological entrenchment that was pretty farcical. And a lot of people saw the farce of it. They saw the insanity of it, and those workers prevailed, and they got their contract. And that was great. And so I came in and got to talk with one of them. And there was this woman, I think she was a lunchroom worker, and she ended up being one of the leaders of these 98 Proud and Strong, as their T-shirts said. These lunchroom workers, school bus drivers, groundskeepers, clerical staff. And she said, I just walked right up to the president of the school board and I said, we're never going to give up, we're never going to give in, and we're never going to go away, so you might as well talk to us. And all of a sudden, there was the chorus of the song, we will never give up, we will never give in, and we'll never ever go away. And then the next piece was me. We will build a brand new future for our daughters and our sons. We will work till all workers rise as one. So, yeah, it's I don't know. I look back on that time, it feels like a lifetime ago, but I can still hear that worker's voice in my head talking to me about, what it meant to her to be a part of something bigger than herself, and to know that when she got up every morning extra early to go be on the picket line, that she was doing it not just for herself and not just for the workers in her union or in her in her community, that this was about standing up to bullies, and she was determined to do it.
But speaking of beautiful songs, I opened it up with "Let Me Sing You a Song," and that was what was it, Pete Seeger?
Well, it's from the album Poets, Philosophers, Workers and Wanderers, and it's a song that I wrote about Pete Seeger.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
I wrote that on the morning that Pete Seeger had passed away. And it was just something that I committed to memory, various conversations he and I had had over the years directly about his time before the House Un-American Activities Committee and what led to it and what the ripple effect was of his testimony. Because many people chose the Fifth Amendment. They chose not to answer questions on the grounds that they might incriminate themselves. And Pete waltzed in there and said, no, I there's nothing for which I should be held criminally liable. All I have done is exercise my First Amendment rights. So if I'm seeking any protection of the Constitution, it's already laid out there in the First Amendment. I have freedom of speech, and I have spoken my truth as I understand it. And that it put him in a very small camp of people that were called before HUAC and chose the First Amendment as their defense, and I thought it was commendable. And so that was the heartbeat of what that song was based on, was not just my limited though impactful friendship for me with Pete Seeger, but the specific conversations that we had had.
Yeah, sorry, I could have phrased that question a whole lot better. Well, I think I think the only real final question I'd have for you that I could probably add to this little radio show would probably be the story behind Winnipeg.
Well, this is a fascinating story. Winnipeg 1919 is a song that I wrote after being exposed to the story of the 1919 Winnipeg General Strike. And then I was invited up to Winnipeg as one of only two U.S. performers invited up there. The rest were all Canadian, to be a part of a festival that was celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Winnipeg General Strike in 2019. And so I had had bits and pieces of this story rolling through my head for almost 20 years. But I finally decided, okay, it's time. I need to write this song. And the inspiration showed up when I needed it, and I wrote a song about the strike. But what happened is the workers seized about 2/3 of the city of Winnipeg because, and across, labor sectors. I mean, it wasn't just, truck drivers or, bus drivers or transit workers or coal miners or whatever. Like, it was just across the board. People were being treated badly, and they held what's called a general strike, and everybody in the city stopped working just long enough to remind the rest of society that nobody gets anything done unless laborers do their work, and that labor has value. It contributes to the wealth of many people and to the sustenance of many people, and that we can't take labor for granted. And they held the city for almost 7 weeks and ended up negotiating some really consequential changes, not just in Winnipeg, but in Canadian labor law eventually. And that rippled across North America and around the world. It was part of changing our sense of what it is that society owes to the laborers who do the heavy lift to keep everything moving forward. And so those workers back in 1919 are, to me, real working class heroes. And I wrote the song to celebrate their victory and to celebrate their work. And of course, every story is more complex and nuanced. And you take a 7-week strike, and that's a whole set of stories. And this is consolidated into, a 4 or 4.5 minute song. So, it's definitely a reductionist version of the narrative, but I really wanted to capture the spirit of a lot of songs that were in what was called the Wobbly Songbook. The industrial workers of the world had a songbook, a little red songbook that was titled Songs to Fan the Flames of Discontent, which I think is just really, talk about truth and advertising. But it was all beautiful and powerful songs of workers witnessing to their own experience, and other people who were a part of the movements witnessing to those experiences. And so many of the workers in 1919 would have been carrying that book in their shirt pocket, and they would get together like we might have a glee club or a barbershop group or a church choir. They would get together and sing the songs and the hymns of their movement. And I thought that was incredibly powerful as an idea. And so I wrote this song not just about that time, but sort of in the spirit of a lot of those songs. I put myself, as if I were writing musical theater, I put myself as a character back in time 100 years and wrote a song that felt like that's what I would have written if I had been there back then. And it turned into this song, which I'm very pleased about. And not long before that, it was only 4 years before that, that I was out in Salt Lake City to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the death of Joe Hill, a very famous organizer here in the United States who was a Swedish immigrant. And I had written a melody that I didn't know what to call. It's a hornpipe. It's a kind of fiddle tune. And then I suddenly realized that I could sing the words to a song that was from that Wobbly songbook, that little red songbook, that I could sing those words to the melody I had written. And then I immediately knew what I was going to call the melody. It's Joe Hill's Hornpipe. And so I recorded a version of Solidarity Forever, the words originally written by Ralph Chaplin for the Wobblies. But I recorded a version of that using my own melody. And it's again it's the celebration. When we started talking about what the work is, sometimes it's to bring the festival atmosphere into the protest and into the demonstration, into the movement, whatever it is. And this song felt like, rather than being mournful, it's celebratory. And so, yeah, there's a little bit of backstory both on Winnipeg 1919 and on my rendition of Solidarity Forever.
Yeah, like I just I just chalked it up to you being a very creative musician and wanting to put your own little stamp on it for why it was different from you know, different from the standard John Brown's body melody.
Yeah, yeah, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Yeah. The Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world, frequently used old hymn melodies to write new words to about their movement, because then all they were teaching was words. Most people already knew the hymns. They were part of the collective consciousness, and yeah, that melody has been repurposed by many people and many times for many different things. But what's interesting is that some of the later verses in the original hymn, in the Battle Hymn of the Republic, do really touch on social justice issues. And I have not committed those verses to memory, but I heard a performance recently, and somebody was singing that song at an open mic at a music camp that I was teaching at. And they really made me listen to words that I had not committed to memory. And I realized, oh, no, there's some real awareness of social justice and social consciousness even inside this old hymn. And that was kind of
Well,
interesting. So that's, I think, part of why it ended up being used by other movements, because there was this palpable sense that the original composition also tied in with equity and with a sense of justice and fairness. And I think social justice at its core isn't a deep intellectual concept. It's just saying treat people well, treat people fairly, follow the golden rule, treat people the way you yourself would want to be treated if you were working in those places doing those things.
well, is that the Battle Hymn of the Republic that actually came later. It's the song started off as John Brown's body, talking about abolitionist John Brown, who took over the firehouse and tried starting a guerrilla movement.
Hmm.
They also there were some verses because it was a military marching song during the Civil War, so there were also some verses where soldiers were complaining about an officer who was also named John Brown. So so it was actually someone else who was basically prompted with saying, "Why don't you write some lyrics to that's a bit more less body and less crass?" And that's where Battle Hymn of the Republic. Sure, they
Yeah,
popped up around
interesting.
the same time, but
Yeah, I'm just looking up. Julia Ward Howe wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic in 1861.
yeah, and
Yeah.
that came after John Brown's body because she was prompted to do that because the verses were rather crass.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I wonder what melody it was before it was yeah, that's super interesting. I'm just looking up these lyrics because I'm curious if I can find any of the later verses that I was talking about. Yeah, I'm not finding what I'm looking for. Are
Uh,
there any other questions you wanted to ask, Thomas?
not I'm out of ideas.
Well, I'm delighted to talk with you today, Thomas. And yeah, thanks so much for the interest in this music and for wanting to pass it on to other people. I looked at the whole playlist that you're sharing, and it's fantastic. So thanks for including some of my recordings and some of my songs in it. And thanks for taking time to ask some good questions about the music and about the movements.
Heck, I've got a friend who's absolutely sick and tired of my taste in music, and he enjoyed the playlist.
Nice. That's great. Well, good luck with the project, and thanks so much.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much for the great conversation.
Thank you for talking with me. I always have fun talking with you, but I always also get so involved in the storytelling that I forget what I was going to say.
It's all good. You've got a lot of fodder to work with now for the interview, and good
Yeah,
luck with that. Nice to see you. Good luck.
thank you.